Lila Chun had always been the odd one out at St. Margaret's orphanage. While other children played with dolls or kicked balls in the courtyard, she spent hours talking to the garden snakes that slithered between the old stone walls. The other kids whispered that she was strange, maybe even cursed. The nuns crossed themselves when they caught her having what seemed like conversations with creatures that couldn't talk back. At 17, Lila had grown tired of being treated like a misfit. Her dark hair was always messy, her clothes never quite fit right, and she had this habit of staring off in a space like she could see things others couldn't. The truth was, she could. Ever since she was small, Lila had been able to sense the emotions of animals around her. Not exactly reading their thoughts, but feeling what they felt. Fear, anger, happiness, loneliness, it all washed over her like waves. The orphanage sat in the shadow of the imperial palace of Drakmor, where Empress Valeria ruled with an iron fist. The Empress was known for two things: her ruthless political mind and her collection of dragons. Real dragons. Not the fairy tale kind, but massive, intelligent beasts that she kept as both symbols of power and weapons of war. The largest and most feared was Ashkor, a black dragon with scales that seemed to absorb light itself. Most people in the city had never seen the dragons up close. They were kept in the palace's eastern tower, guarded by soldiers and protected by magic barriers. But Lila could feel them. Every night, lying in her narrow bed at the orphanage, she sensed their restless energy. Ashkor's emotions hit her the strongest, a deep, aching loneliness that made her heart hurt. One autumn morning, everything changed. The orphanage received an unexpected visitor. A tall woman in expensive silk robes arrived with a carriage bearing the imperial seal. She introduced herself as Lady Mirren, the Empress's personal advisor. The nuns rushed around like startled chickens, bowing and apologizing for the humble state of their home. "I'm here on behalf of Her Imperial Majesty," Lady Mirren announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "The palace requires additional servants. Young people who are adaptable." Lila watched from the corner as Lady Mirren walked through the orphanage, studying each child like she was selecting fruit at a market. When her sharp blue eyes fell on Lila, something flickered across her face. Interest, maybe, or recognition. "You." Lady Mirren pointed at Lila. "What's your name?" "Lila Chun, my lady." Lila tried to curtsy like the nuns had taught her, but she stumbled slightly. "How old are you, child?" 17, my lady." Lady Mirren circled around her, examining her from every angle. "The nuns tell me you're difficult to manage, that you talk to animals." Heat rose in Lila's cheeks. "I don't talk to them exactly. I just understand them sometimes." Instead of laughing or looking disgusted, Lady Mirren nodded slowly. "Interesting. Very interesting indeed." She turned to Mother Superior, who was wringing her hands nervously. "This one will come with me. Today." "Today," Mother Superior squeaked. "But surely, today," Lady Mirren repeated, her tone brooking no argument. "Have her things packed immediately." Lila's few belongings fit into a small cloth bundle. A worn dress, an old book of poetry that someone had donated to the orphanage, and a smooth river stone she'd found years ago that somehow always felt warm in her hand. As she prepared to leave the only home she'd ever known, the other children watched her with a mixture of envy and relief. Envy because she was escaping to the palace, relief because the strange girl would finally be gone. The carriage ride to the palace took less than an hour, but it felt like traveling to another world. The imperial palace of Drakmor was massive, built from black stone that gleamed like obsidian. Towers stretched toward the sky, connected by bridges that seemed to float in midair. Gardens sprawled in every direction, filled with flowers that bloomed in impossible colors. But what struck Lila most was the emotional atmosphere of the place. Fear hung in the air like morning mist. The servants they passed kept their heads down and moved quickly, as if afraid of being noticed. Guards stood at every corner, their hands never far from their weapons. And underlying everything was a sense of barely controlled power, like standing next to a volcano that might erupt at any moment. Lady Mirren led her through a maze of corridors lined with portraits of previous emperors and empresses. Their painted eyes seemed to follow Lila as she walked. Finally, they stopped at a small chamber furnished with a simple bed, a chest for belongings, and a window that looked out toward the eastern tower. "Your quarters," Lady Mirren said. "You'll start work tomorrow. Kitchen duty first to see how you adapt." She paused at the door. "A word of advice, child. In this palace, curiosity can be dangerous. Keep your head down, do your work, and don't ask questions about things that don't concern you." "Yes, my lady." After Lady Mirren left, Lila sat on her narrow bed and looked out the window. The eastern tower loomed in the distance, its walls thick and windowless. But even from here, she could feel them. The dragons. Their emotions washed over her in waves: boredom, frustration, and that overwhelming loneliness from Ashkor that made her chest tight. That night, Lila couldn't sleep. The palace was never truly quiet. Footsteps echoed in distant corridors. Doors creaked open and shut, and somewhere in the walls, she could hear the whisper of air moving through hidden passages. But louder than any of that was the emotional pull from the eastern tower. It called to her like a lighthouse beacon. She tried to ignore it. Lady Mirren's warning echoed in her mind. But as the hours passed, the pull grew stronger. Ashkor wasn't just lonely, he was in pain. Not physical pain, but something deeper. Emotional agony that cut through all the barriers Lila usually kept around her mind. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore. She slipped out of her room and into the darkened corridor. The palace at night was a different creature entirely. Shadows moved in ways that didn't match any light source she could see. Tapestries seemed to shift and whisper as she passed. But Lila had grown up in an old building full of strange noises and moving shadows. She wasn't easily spooked. Finding the eastern tower wasn't difficult. She just followed the emotional pull, like following a rope through the darkness. The tower's entrance was guarded, but the guards were playing dice and drinking wine from a shared bottle. They were too distracted to notice a small figure slip past them and into the tower's base. The tower's interior was built around a central spiral staircase that climbed up into darkness. As Lila began to climb, the emotional intensity increased. Other dragons sensed her presence, their curiosity and wariness washing over her like heat from an oven. But she pressed on, drawn upward by that singular call of pain and loneliness. The staircase seemed to go on forever. Her legs burned, and her breath came in short gasps, but she didn't stop. At the very top, she found a massive circular chamber with a domed ceiling painted with stars. The room was dimly lit by crystals embedded in the walls, giving everything an otherworldly blue glow. And there, in the center of the chamber, was Ashkor. He was enormous, easily the size of a small building. His scales were so black they seemed to absorb light, and his eyes glowed like molten gold. Massive chains bound his legs to iron rings set into the floor. More chains wrapped around his neck and wings, preventing him from moving more than a few feet in any direction. When he saw Lila, Ashkor let out a low rumble that she felt in her bones. His emotions hit her like a physical blow: surprise, wariness, and underneath it all, that terrible, crushing loneliness that had drawn her here. "Hello," Lila whispered, stepping into the chamber. Ashkor's great head swung toward her, and for a moment, their eyes met. In that instant, Lila felt something she'd never experienced before. A connection. Not just the one-sided empathy she'd always had with animals, but something mutual. Ashkor could sense her too. The dragon's rumble deepened, and Lila realized he was trying to communicate. Not with words, but with something deeper. Images flashed through her mind, memories that weren't her own, flying through clouds with the sun warming scales. The taste of freedom, the joy of soaring high above mountains and valleys. And then capture. Chains. Years and years of imprisonment in this tower. used as a weapon when the Empress needed to intimidate her enemies. Tears ran down Lila's cheeks as she felt Ashkor's memories. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." She stepped closer, and the dragon lowered his massive head toward her. This close, she could see that his scales weren't truly black. They held depths of blue and purple and green like oil on water. His eyes were ancient and intelligent, holding decades of experience and wisdom. Without really thinking about what she was doing, Lila reached out and placed her hand on the dragon's snout. His scales were surprisingly warm and smooth. Ashkor went very still, as if afraid that any movement might break this moment of connection. And then, guided by an instinct she didn't understand, Lila leaned forward and gently pressed her lips to the dragon's forehead, just above his eyes. It was barely a kiss, more like a blessing or a promise. The moment their connection deepened, everything changed. Power flowed between them like electricity. Not magical power, something older and more fundamental. Trust, understanding, recognition of kindred spirits who had both been caged by circumstances beyond their control. Ashkor's eyes widened, and he let out a sound unlike anything Lila had ever heard. Not quite a roar, not quite a song, but something that spoke of wonder and hope and the first stirring of something that had been dormant for years. But their moment was shattered by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Multiple sets of feet, moving fast and with purpose. Voices echoed up from below, guards shouting orders, someone calling for reinforcements. "Someone's in the tower. Check every level. If anything has happened to the dragons, the Empress will have our heads." Lila pulled back from Ashkor, her heart racing. The dragon's eyes held hers for another moment, and she felt his desperate desire for her to escape safely. But there was nowhere to go. The tower had only one entrance, and the guards were already climbing toward her. "I have to go," she whispered to Ashkor, "but I'll come back. I promise." The dragon rumbled softly, and Lila felt his gratitude wash over her like warm sunlight. As the footsteps grew louder, she looked around desperately for another way out. That's when she noticed something she'd missed before. A narrow window set high in the curved wall, barely wide enough for a person squeezed through. Without hesitation, Lila climbed the chains that bound Ashkor's wing. The dragon held perfectly still, helping her as much as he could. She reached the window just as torchlight began to flicker in the stairwell. The opening led to a ledge that ran around the outside of the tower. It was dangerous, but not impossible for someone small and agile. As she squeezed through the window, Lila looked back at Ashkor one last time. His golden eyes followed her, and she felt his emotions clearly. Worry for her safety, but also something new. Hope. For the first time in decades, the great dragon had hope. The climb down the outside of the tower was terrifying. The ledge was narrow and crumbling, and the drop to the courtyard below would certainly be fatal. But Lila had spent her childhood climbing the walls of the orphanage, and desperation gave her strength and courage she didn't know she possessed. She made it back to her quarters just as the guards completed their search of the tower. From her window, she could see their torches moving in the darkness as they expanded their search to other parts of the palace. But they found nothing suspicious, just an orphan girl sleeping peacefully in her bed. As dawn broke over the palace, Lila lay staring at the ceiling and thinking about what had happened. She could still feel Ashkor's presence like a warm glow in the back of her mind. The connection they'd formed wasn't broken by distance. If anything, it seemed to be growing stronger. She knew her life had changed forever in that moment when she'd kissed the dragon's forehead. She didn't understand how or why, but something fundamental had shifted between them. Ashkor was no longer just another trapped creature she felt sorry for. He was important, connected to her in a way that went deeper than empathy. And somehow, she knew this was only the beginning. The next few weeks at the palace passed in a strange blur of routine and secret anticipation. During the day, Lila worked in the kitchens, scrubbing pots and preparing vegetables alongside the other servants. She kept her head down and spoke only when spoken to, following Lady Mirren's advice to avoid drawing attention to herself. But the connection with Ashkor grew stronger every day. Even while kneading bread or carrying water buckets, she could feel his presence in her mind like a warm current. Sometimes emotions would wash over her so suddenly that she'd stop mid-task, overwhelmed by feelings that weren't her own. Frustration when visitors came to gawk at the dragons. Rage when the guards used electric prods to make them perform for entertainment. And always, that deep loneliness that made her chest ache. The other kitchen servants began to notice her distraction. Maria, an older woman who'd worked in the palace for 20 years, pulled Lila aside one morning. "Child, you've been acting strange lately," Maria said, her weathered hands gentle as she guided Lila to a quiet corner. "You stop working sometimes and just stand there like you're listening to something the rest of us can't hear. Is everything all right?" Lila forced a smile. "Just adjusting to palace life, I suppose. It's very different from the orphanage." Maria studied her with knowing eyes. "I've seen a lot of new servants come and go. Most are either terrified or excited. You look haunted, like you're carrying someone else's pain." The accuracy of Maria's observation made Lila's breath catch. But before she could respond, the kitchen door burst open and Lady Mirren swept in, her silk robes rustling with urgency. "Where's the girl?" Lady Mirren demanded. "Lila Chun." Lila stepped forward, her heart hammering. "Here, my lady, come with me." Now, as they hurried through the palace corridors, Lady Mirren spoke in clipped, urgent tones. "The Empress wishes to see you. You are to speak only when spoken to, answer honestly, and under no circumstances should you mention anything about dragons unless directly asked. Do you understand?" "Yes, my lady." The throne room was massive, with columns that stretched up into shadows and walls lined with weapons from conquered kingdoms. Empress Valeria sat on a throne carved from a single piece of black stone, her silver hair pulled back severely and her green eyes sharp as emeralds. She was beautiful in the way that predators are beautiful, sleek, dangerous, and utterly commanding. "Approach," the Empress commanded, her voice echoing in the vast space. Lila walked forward on shaking legs, trying to remember how to curtsy properly. When she was about 10 feet from the throne, she dropped into what she hoped was an acceptable bow. "You're the orphan girl," Empress Valeria said. It wasn't a question. The one with an affinity for animals. "Yes, your Imperial Majesty." The Empress studied her with those piercing green eyes. "Tell me, child, what exactly is this affinity? Can you speak with beasts?" Lila hesitated, remembering Lady Mirren's warnings. But the Empress had asked directly, and lying to a ruler who could probably sense deception seemed like a terrible idea. "Not speak, exactly, your Majesty. I can feel what they feel. Their emotions. Sometimes I see images like memories, but it's not conversation." "Interesting." The Empress leaned forward slightly. "And this gift works with all animals?" "Most of them, your Majesty. Stronger with some than others." Empress Valeria was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the arm of her throne. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. "I have a problem, child. My dragons have been restless lately. More aggressive, less responsive to their handlers. The trainer believes it's a temporary phase, but I'm not convinced. I want you to observe them. See if your unusual gift can provide any insights into their behavior." Lila's mouth went dry. "You want me to go near the dragons, your Majesty? I want you to study them. From a safe distance, naturally. The trainer will accompany you, and guards will be present at all times." The Empress's eyes narrowed. "Unless, of course, you're too frightened?" There was a challenge in her voice, and Lila realized this was some kind of test. "No, your Majesty. I'm not afraid." "Good. You'll begin tomorrow. Lady Mirren will provide you with appropriate clothing and instructions." As Lila left the throne room, her mind raced. The Empress was sending her to observe the dragons officially, which meant she could see Ashkor without sneaking around. But it also meant closer scrutiny, more chances to accidentally reveal the connection they've formed. That night, she couldn't resist making one more secret visit to the tower. She developed a route that avoided the guards, using service corridors and forgotten stairways that Maria had mentioned. When she reached Ashkor's chamber, she found him waiting for her, his great head turned toward the window she'd used before. "Did you know?" she whispered as she approached him. "Did you somehow know the Empress would want me to visit you officially?" Ashkor rumbled softly, and images flashed through their connection. The dragon had been deliberately more difficult for his handlers, refusing commands and acting aggressive. Not enough to warrant punishment, but enough to make the Empress notice something was wrong. "You've been causing trouble to create an excuse for me to visit you," Lila realized, and she felt Ashkor's amusement ripple through their bond. "That was risky. What if she decided you were too dangerous and ordered you destroyed?" The dragon's amusement faded, replaced by something grimmer. More images flowed through their connection, memories of other dragons who had been killed when they became too difficult to control, but also a sense of determination. Ashkor would rather risk death than continue the endless years of isolation. Lila reached up to touch his snout, and the dragon lowered his head to make it easier for her. The contact always intensified their connection, allowing emotions and images to flow more freely between them. "I promise I'll find a way to help you," she whispered. "I don't know how yet, but there has to be something we can do." Ashkor's response was complex, gratitude mixed with protectiveness and a fierce desire to keep her safe. He'd lived long enough to understand the dangers of the palace better than she did. But underneath those concerns was something that made Lila's heart skip: love. Not romantic love, but something deeper and more fundamental. The love of kindred spirits who recognized each other across the barriers of species and circumstance. The next morning, Lila was given new clothes, sturdy leather boots, thick pants, and a padded jacket that would offer some protection from claws or flame. Master Victor, the dragon trainer, was a grizzled man with burned scars covering half his face and arms that looked like tree trunks. "So you're the girl who thinks she can read animal minds," Victor said, his tone skeptical. "Dragons aren't pets, child. They're weapons. Intelligent, cunning weapons that would kill you without hesitation if given the chance." "Understand, Master Victor." He snorted. "We'll see. Come along, then. Let's introduce you to our collection." The Eastern Tower looked different in daylight. Clean and efficient rather than mysterious and threatening. Victor led her up the spiral staircase, explaining the history and temperament of each dragon they passed. "Pyrian here is our youngest," he said, stopping at a chamber where a red dragon about the size of a large horse paced restlessly. "Still has some fight in him, but he's learning." Lightning burns taught him to respect the handlers. Lila felt Pyrian's emotions as they watched him: pain, fear, and a crushing sense of defeat that made her stomach turn. The young dragon had been broken, his spirit systematically destroyed, until all that remained was obedience born of terror. They continued upward, past Seraphina, an elegant silver dragon whose wings had been clipped to prevent flight, and Thorax, a brown dragon whose scales were dull with malnutrition and neglect. Each one was a prisoner, chained and controlled through pain and fear. And at the top, Victor said as they climbed the final set of stairs, "We have Ashkor, our prize, the Empress's personal dragon and the most dangerous beast in the Empire." When they entered Ashkor's chamber, Lila had to work hard to hide her familiarity with the space. She let her eyes widen as if seeing the massive dragon for the first time, and gasped appropriately at his size and fierce appearance. But through their connection, she felt Ashkor's careful control. He was playing a role too, the dangerous, unpredictable beast that everyone expected him to be. His golden eyes fixed on her with what looked like predatory interest, but she felt his relief and joy at seeing her again. "Keep your distance," Victor warned, pulling her back when she instinctively stepped forward. He's killed 3 trainers over the years. Smart enough to make it look like accidents, but we know better. What does he want? Lila asked, genuinely curious about Victor's perspective. Freedom, most likely. They all do at first. But Ashkor's different. Older, more cunning. He's been planning something for years. I can feel it. The way he watches everything, remembers every detail. If he ever gets loose. Victor didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. Ashkor would destroy everything he could reach if given the chance. For the next hour, Victor had Lila observe while he put Ashkor through a series of exercises. Commands to move, to roar on cue, to demonstrate his fire-breathing ability. Through their connection, Lila felt the dragon's hatred for these performances, but also his calculated cooperation. Ashkor was playing a long game, and open rebellion would only make his situation worse. Well, Victor asked when they were finished. What do you sense from him? Lila chose her words carefully. He's very intelligent, more than the others, and lonely, I think. But there's something else, like he's waiting for something. Victor nodded grimly. That's what worries me. A dragon who's waiting is a dragon who's planning. He studied Ashkor with professional wariness. I've recommended increased security measures, but the Empress believes the chains are sufficient. As they left the chamber, Lila felt Ashkor's emotions following her. Frustration at their limited time together, but also something that might have been pride. She played her part well, giving Victor insights that seemed genuine without revealing the true nature of their connection. Over the following weeks, Lila's official visits to the tower became routine. She observed all the dragons, taking careful notes that she submitted to Lady Mirren, who passed them on to the Empress. Her reports were accurate but carefully edited. She described the dragon's emotional states without mentioning her ability to communicate with them directly. But the real purpose of these visits was the time she spent with Ashkor. During the official observations, they had to be careful, communicating only through subtle glances and the emotional connection they shared. But those moments of contact were enough to deepen their bond. Lila began to understand that Ashkor was far older than anyone realized. Through their connection, she caught glimpses of memories spanning centuries. He remembered when dragons flew free across the continent, before the wars that led to their capture and enslavement. He'd seen empires rise and fall, watched the world change in ways that made humans seem like brief sparks in the darkness. But he'd also been alone for so long that he'd almost forgotten what companionship felt like. The connection with Lila was awakening parts of himself that had been dormant for decades. One evening, as Lila was leaving the tower after an official visit, she encountered someone unexpected in the corridor. A young man about her own age with dark hair and the kind of pale skin that suggested he spent most of his time indoors. He wore the rich clothing of nobility, but carried himself with a nervous energy that seemed at odds with his privileged status. "You're the girl who's been studying the dragons," he said, stepping in her path. Lila bobbed a quick curtsy, unsure of his rank. "Yes, my lord. Prince Adrian," he corrected, though he seemed uncomfortable with the title. "I'm the Empress's nephew." Lila's curtsy deepened. She'd heard of Prince Adrian, though she'd never seen him before. He was said to be scholarly and quiet, more interested in books than politics or military matters. "I've been reading your reports," Adrian continued. "The observations you've submitted to my aunt. They're fascinating. You write about the dragons as if they're individuals rather than just weapons. They're individuals, Your Highness. Each one has a distinct personality and emotional pattern." Adrian nodded eagerly. "That's exactly what I hope to hear. I've been studying dragon lore for years, reading everything I can find about their intelligence and social structures. Most people see them as monsters, but I believe they're far more complex than anyone realizes." Lila felt a spark of hope. Could Prince Adrian be an ally? Someone who might help her find a way to improve conditions for the dragons? "Would you?" Adrian hesitated, then seemed to gather his courage. "Would you be willing to discuss your observations with me in more detail? I have access to historical texts that might provide context for their behavior." "I would be honored, Your Highness." Tomorrow evening, then, the library in the West Wing. I'll leave word with the guards to expect you. As Adrian walked away, Lila felt a complex mix of emotions. Hope, because she might have found someone who could help. But also fear because getting involved with palace politics could be dangerous for someone in her position. That night, she made another secret visit to Ashkor to tell him about the encounter with Prince Adrian. The dragon listened to her whispered account with intense interest, and she felt his emotions shift from curiosity to something like excitement. Through their connection, Ashkor shared more memories. Images of Prince Adrian visiting the tower years ago as a child, staring at the dragons with wonder rather than fear. Unlike most visitors, the young prince had never seemed to enjoy the demonstrations of power. Instead, he looked sad, as if he understood that he was watching caged beings rather than mere weapons. "You think we can trust him?" Lila asked. Ashkor's response was complex. Trust was a luxury that dragons in captivity couldn't afford. But if anyone in the royal family might be sympathetic to their situation, it would be the scholarly prince who saw dragons as intelligent beings rather than tools of war. The meeting with Prince Adrian the next evening changed everything. The library was a vast space filled with books that climbed toward the vaulted ceiling, and Adrian had prepared a table covered with ancient texts and maps. "Look at this," he said, showing her a beautifully illustrated manuscript. "This is from before the Dragon Wars, when they lived in organized communities. They had complex social hierarchies, shared knowledge across generations, even created art forms that we're only beginning to understand." Lila studied the illustrations of dragons living freely and felt Ashkor's intense, longing echo through their connection. These images matched some of the memories he'd shared with her. "What happened to change everything?" she asked. Adrian's expression darkened. "Fear. When humans first encountered dragons, some tried to communicate and coexist, but others saw them as threats to be eliminated or resources to be exploited. The wars that followed nearly drove them extinct. The few survivors were captured and enslaved. But surely there must be others still living free somewhere. Perhaps. There are rumors of dragons in the far northern mountains, beyond the reach of any empire. But here in the civilized lands," he gestured helplessly, "what you see in that tower is likely all that remains." Lila felt tears prick her eyes as she thought of Ashkor and the other dragons chained and alone. "It's not right. They deserve better." Adrian looked at her sharply. "That's a dangerous sentiment in this palace. My aunt sees the dragons as weapons and symbols of her power. Suggesting they should be treated differently could be seen as treason." "Then what can we do?" "I don't know yet, but I've been thinking documenting their intelligence, their capacity for emotion, their complex social needs, building a case that they deserve better treatment. Maybe, eventually, even freedom." The conversation continued late into the night, and by the time they parted, Lila felt like she'd found not just an ally, but a true friend. Prince Adrian shared her conviction that the dragons deserved better, and he had resources and knowledge that she lacked. But as she made her way back to her quarters, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a dangerous path. The Empress ruled with absolute authority, and challenging her treatment of the dragons would require careful planning and perfect timing. In the Eastern Tower, Ashkor sensed her approach and her complex emotions. Through their connection, he felt her hope, her determination, and her fear. But stronger than all of those was something new, the growing certainty that change was coming. For the first time in decades, the great dragon allowed himself to believe that freedom might be possible. And that belief, fragile as it was, began to burn in his ancient heart like the first spark of a fire that might eventually consume everything. 3 months after her first secret meeting with Prince Adrian, Lila found herself at the center of a conspiracy that would either free the dragons or get them all executed for treason. Their evening meetings in the library had become a regular occurrence, with Adrian teaching her to read ancient dragon texts while she provided insights into the creature's current emotional states and needs. The breakthrough came when they discovered references to something called the Dragon Bond in an old manuscript Adrian had found in the palace's deepest archives. The text was written in an ancient language that took weeks to translate, but the implications were staggering. According to this, Adrian explained, his voice trembling with excitement, dragons can form deep psychic connections with humans. Not just communication, but actual sharing of consciousness. The bond makes both partners stronger, more capable than either could be alone. Lila's heart raced as she listened. The manuscript was describing exactly what she'd experienced with Ashkor, but she hadn't dared tell Adrian about the true depth of their connection. It had seemed too impossible, too dangerous to reveal. The text says the bond can only form between compatible souls, Adrian continued. It's incredibly rare. Maybe 1 in a million humans have the potential. But when it does happen, the dragon and human become partners rather than master and slave. What happened to people who formed these bonds? Lila asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. During the Dragon Wars, they were hunted down and killed. The authorities saw the bond as a threat to human dominance. Bonded pairs fought together against the armies that tried to enslave the dragons, and they were nearly impossible to defeat. Adrian looked up from the manuscript, his eyes bright with possibility. But, Lila, if someone could form a bond today, if we could prove that dragons are willing partners rather than conquered enemies, the Empress would never accept that. Maybe not, but there are others in the court who might listen. Trade partners who are growing uncomfortable with the Empire's use of dragons as weapons of intimidation. Neighboring kingdoms who would prefer diplomatic solutions to military threats. Adrian leaned forward intensely. If we could demonstrate a peaceful alternative to dragon enslavement, we might be able to change everything. That night, Lila made her way to Ashkor's chamber with her heart pounding. She had to tell him about the manuscript, about the possibility that their connection might be something far more significant than either of them had realized. When she reached the top of the tower, she found Ashkor waiting for her as always. But something was different. The dragon seemed more alert, more focused than usual. Before she could speak, images flooded through their connection, memories of the ancient times described in the manuscript, when dragons and humans fought together as equals. You remember, Lila whispered in amazement. You remember the bonds. Ashkor's response was complex. Yes, he remembered, but those memories were from the racial consciousness that all dragons shared, passed down through generations. He'd never experienced a true bond himself until now. The connection between them had been growing stronger every day, and Lila was beginning to understand that she could access not just Ashkor's emotions and memories, but his knowledge and wisdom as well. The ancient dragon's understanding of magic and the natural world was vast, accumulated over centuries of observation and experience. The manuscript says bonded pairs can share abilities, Lila said. The humans can access dragon magic, and dragons can understand human emotions and motivations more deeply. Through their connection, Ashkor confirmed this. He'd been feeling changes in himself as well, a growing understanding of human nature that went beyond his previous experience. But, more importantly, he could sense the potential in Lila for abilities she didn't even know she possessed. Show me, Lila whispered. What happened next changed everything. Ashkor guided her consciousness deeper into their connection, and suddenly, Lila could see through his eyes. Not just images, but actual sensory input. She could see the magical auras that surrounded all living things, feel the flow of energy through the palace's protective wards, sense the presence of every person in the building. But it went further than that. Through Ashkor's ancient knowledge, she began to understand how magic worked. Not just dragon magic, but all forms of mystical energy. The chains that bound Ashkor were more than mere metal. They were inscribed with binding spells that specifically prevented dragons from accessing their magical abilities. I can see the spells, Lila gasped, her consciousness still partially merged with Ashkor's. The binding enchantments. They're like locks, and I think I might be able to find the key. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. If she could figure out how to neutralize the binding spells, Ashkor could break free. But one dragon escaping wouldn't solve the larger problem. It would only lead to increased security and probably Lila's execution. They needed a bigger plan. Over the following weeks, Lila worked with Prince Adrian to develop a strategy that went far beyond simply freeing the dragons. They would need to change the entire political landscape, convincing key figures in the court that the dragon program was both morally wrong and strategically dangerous. Adrian had been quietly building support among younger nobles who were uncomfortable with the Empire's increasingly aggressive policies. Many of them saw the dragon program as a symptom of the Empress's growing paranoia and willingness to use fear as a tool of control. "There's going to be a diplomatic summit next month," Adrian told her during one of their library meetings. "Representatives from 5 neighboring kingdoms will be here to discuss trade agreements. My aunt always arranges a demonstration of dragon power during these events to remind our neighbors of the Empire's military strength." "What kind of demonstration?" "Combat exercice. The dragons are forced to fight against prisoners or condemned criminals. It's meant to show their power and the Empire's control over them." Adrian's expression was grim. "It's barbaric, but it's also an opportunity. If something went wrong during the demonstration, if the dragons somehow turned against their handlers," Lila understood immediately. "It would show that the current system is unstable, that controlling dragons through fear and pain isn't reliable." "Exactly. And if, at the same time, someone could demonstrate a better alternative, a way to work with dragons as partners rather than weapons." The plan they developed was incredibly risky. During the diplomatic demonstration, Lila would use her connection with Ashkor to coordinate a rebellion among all the dragons simultaneously. But instead of a chaotic escape attempt that would end in bloodshed, they would demonstrate the power of the dragon bond. Lila would publicly reveal her connection with Ashkor, showing the assembled diplomats that dragons could be willing partners rather than enslaved weapons. Adrian would present the historical evidence they'd gathered, arguing that the bond represented a return to an older, more stable relationship between the species. "If it works," Adrian said, "we might be able to convince the other kingdoms to pressure my aunt into changing the dragon program. Economic sanctions, trade embargoes, diplomatic isolation. She can't rule an empire that's completely cut off from the rest of the world. And if it doesn't work, then we'll probably all be executed for treason." The night before the diplomatic summit, Lila made what she knew might be her final secret visit to Ashkor's chamber. Tomorrow, their connection would be revealed to the world, and their lives would change forever, one way or another. "Are you ready?" she whispered, placing her hands on the dragon's great head. Through their bond, she felt Ashkor's determination. He'd been a prisoner for over a century, watching his fellow dragons waste away in captivity while the world forgot that they'd once been free. The chance to change that was worth any risk. But more than that, she felt his love for her. Not just gratitude for companionship, but genuine affection for the strange human girl who'd seen him as a person rather than a weapon. Their bond had awakened parts of his soul that he'd thought were dead forever. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Lila said, "I want you to know that meeting you changed my life. Before you, I was just a misfit orphan with a weird gift. But you helped me understand that being different isn't something to hide from. It's something to embrace." Ashkor's response was warm and complex, filled with images of the future he hoped they might share, flying together above the clouds, teaching other humans and dragons to form bonds, building a world where both species could live freely and in harmony. The diplomatic demonstration was held in the palace's great courtyard, with visiting dignitaries arranged in viewing boxes that provided both an excellent view and protection from dragonfire. Empress Valeria sat on a portable throne, resplendent in armor that had been polished to a mirror shine. Lila stood with the other servants in a designated area, her heart hammering as she watched the proceedings. Master Victor supervised a team of handlers who brought out 3 dragons for the demonstration, Pyrian, Seraphina, and, finally, Ashkor. The first part of the demonstration went according to plan. The younger dragons performed their exercises reluctantly, but obediently, breathing fire on command and demonstrating their physical power. The visiting diplomats watched with expressions ranging from awe to disgust, clearly impressed by the dragon's capabilities, but uncomfortable with the obvious cruelty of the situation. Then came Ashkor's turn. The great black dragon was led into the center of the courtyard, his chains clanking with every step. Even bound and controlled, he was magnificent, easily twice the size of the other dragons, with an aura of barely contained power that made even the bravest spectators lean back in their seats. "Behold Ashkor," the Empress announced, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "The most powerful dragon in the known world, and the crown jewel of our empire's strength." Master Victor raised his control staff, ready to command Ashkor to demonstrate his fire-breathing ability. But instead of waiting for the command, Lila stepped forward from the servants' area. "Your Imperial Majesty," she called out, her voice somehow carrying despite her nervousness. "I request permission to demonstrate something that will change your understanding of dragon capabilities forever." The courtyard fell silent. Empress Valeria's eyes fixed on Lila with laser intensity, and she could feel the attention of everyone present focused on her like a physical weight. "Explain yourself," the Empress commanded. "Dragons are not weapons to be controlled, Your Majesty. They are intelligent beings capable of partnership and cooperation. I can prove this through a bond that has formed between myself and Ashkor." Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the audience. Master Victor stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Your Majesty, this servant girl is clearly delusional. Ashkor is a killer, not a pet. She should be removed immediately." Before silence, the Empress held up a hand, her gaze never leaving Lila's face. "Continue, child, but be aware that if you're lying or attempting some form of deception, the consequences will be severe." Lila walked slowly toward Ashkor, acutely aware that dozens of guards had arrows trained on her and crossbows aimed at the dragon. Through their connection, she felt Ashkor's steady presence, his absolute trust in her despite the danger they were both facing. When she reached the dragon, she looked up into his golden eyes and smiled. "Hello, my friend." Then, in full view of the assembled diplomats and the entire court, Lila reached up and placed her hands on Ashkor's snout. The dragon lowered his great head to make the contact easier, and the moment their connection deepened, everything changed. Power flowed between them, visible as a soft golden glow that emanated from the point of contact and spread along Ashkor's scales. The dragon's eyes blazed with light that matched Lila's own, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that could only come from a dragon's throat. "Ashkor wishes to address the assembly," Lila said, her words somehow carrying both her own accent and the dragon's ancient dignity. Through their merged consciousness, Ashkor spoke directly to the assembled crowd, his words channeled through Lila's voice, but carrying the weight of centuries. "I am Ashkor of the Skiricher clan, last son of Pyrethia the Wise, and I have been a prisoner in this place for 137 years. In that time, I have watched my people waste away in captivity, reduced from proud guardians of the ancient knowledge to mere tools of war." The courtyard was dead silent. Even Empress Valeria seemed stunned, her face pale as she stared at the impossible sight of her prized weapon speaking through a servant girl. "But now," Ashkor continued through Lila, "I have found what I thought was lost forever. A human soul capable of true partnership, one who sees beyond species to the person within. Through this bond, I offer a different path forward. Not the domination of dragon by human or human by dragon, but cooperation between equals." Master Victor chose that moment to act, raising his control staff and activating the pain enchantments built into Ashkor's chains. Electricity coursed through the metal, designed to force the dragon into submission. But the power flowed harmlessly around the golden glow that surrounded the bonded pair. Through their merged consciousness, Lila and Ashkor had access to magical abilities that neither possessed alone. The binding spells that had held Ashkor for over a century simply dissolved. The chains fell away like melted ice, clanging to the courtyard stones as Ashkor stretched his wings for the first time in decades. The dragon was free, but instead of rampaging or seeking revenge, he remained perfectly still with Lila's hands still touching his snout. "This is what partnership looks like," Lila said, her voice now clearly her own but still carrying echoes of dragon harmony. "Not control through pain and fear, but cooperation through trust and mutual respect." Prince Adrian stepped forward from the diplomatic viewing area, carrying a leather portfolio filled with their research. "Your Majesty, honored delegates," he said formally, "what you've just witnessed confirms historical accounts of dragon-human bonds that existed before the wars. This isn't magic or trickery. It's a return to a relationship our ancestors knew was possible." Empress Valeria finally found her voice. "Seize them," she commanded the guards. "This is clearly some form of elaborate deception designed to—" "Your Imperial Majesty," interrupted Ambassador Kellen from the Kingdom of Westmarch, standing up in his viewing box. "If I may suggest that we hear the full presentation before taking action. What we've just seen has significant implications for the current diplomatic situation." Other ambassadors murmured agreement. They'd come to this summit with existing concerns about the Empire's increasingly aggressive stance, and the demonstration of an alternative to dragon-based military intimidation was exactly what they'd been hoping to see. Realizing that her political position was suddenly much more precarious, Empress Valeria forced herself to sit back on her throne. "Very well. Continue." What followed was the most important hour of Lila's life. With Ashkor's ancient knowledge flowing through their bond, and Prince Adrian providing historical context, they presented a complete case for ending the dragon program and establishing a new relationship between the species. They showed how the current system was unsustainable. Dragons in captivity lived shorter lives, became increasingly violent, and required enormous resources to maintain. They presented evidence that free dragons had actually helped human settlements in the distant past, sharing knowledge and defending against common threats. Most importantly, they demonstrated that the dragon bond wasn't just possible, but could be replicated. Through Ashkor's racial memories, they identified other humans in the assembly who had the potential for bonding, including 2 of the visiting ambassadors and, surprisingly, Empress Valeria herself. "The choice before us," Prince Adrian concluded, "is between a future built on fear and dominance, or one built on cooperation and mutual benefit. The dragons of this empire could be partners in prosperity rather than weapons of war." The debate that followed lasted until well past sunset. The visiting ambassadors were clearly intrigued by the possibilities, while the Empress's advisors argued for maintaining the current system. But the most compelling voice came from Ashkor himself, speaking through his bond with Lila about the loneliness and despair of captivity and the hope that the new partnership represented. In the end, it was economics rather than morality that tipped the balance. The cost of maintaining the dragon program was enormous, and the other kingdoms made it clear that they were prepared to impose sanctions if the practice continued. The Empire needed trade partners more than it needed weapons of intimidation. But the real victory came when Empress Valeria, after hours of heated discussion, finally approached Lila and Ashkor directly. "Show me," she commanded, her voice tight with conflicted emotions. "This bond you claim exists. I want to experience it for myself." What happened next stunned everyone, including Lila. The Empress had always seemed cold and calculating, driven purely by power and politics. But when Ashkor shared a gentle touch of the bond with her, just enough to let her feel a dragon's perspective, Valeria's carefully maintained composure cracked. Tears streamed down her face as she experienced, for the first time, the emotional reality of what her dragon program had meant. The loneliness, the pain, the slow death of hope in creatures that had once soared freely through the skies. I never understood, she whispered, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch Ashkor's scales. I thought they were animals. Dangerous, but still just animals. They are people, Lila said gently. Different from us, but people nonetheless. With their own dreams, fears, and capacity for love. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Changing the Empire's policies required months of negotiation, planning, and careful implementation. But on that day in the courtyard, everything shifted. The age of dragon enslavement began to end, and a new chapter of cooperation began. Ashkor was the first dragon formally freed, and he chose to remain with Lila as her bonded partner. Together, they worked to establish relationships with the other captured dragons, helping them readjust to freedom and, in some cases, form their own bonds with compatible humans. Prince Adrian became the Empire's first dragon ambassador, traveling to other kingdoms to share their discoveries and help establish similar programs. The research they'd begun in the palace library became the foundation for a new academic field studying human-dragon cooperation. But perhaps the most surprising change was in Empress Valeria herself. The brief touch of the bond had awakened something in her that she'd thought was long dead, the capacity for empathy and genuine care for others. She began working with the dragon Seraphina, slowly building the trust necessary for a bond of their own. Power, Valeria said to Lila during one of their planning meetings, doesn't have to mean domination. I'm beginning to understand that true strength comes from lifting others up rather than holding them down. As for Lila, her life had been transformed beyond anything she could have imagined when she was just a misfit orphan girl scrubbing pots in the palace kitchen. The connection with Ashkor had revealed abilities and purposes she'd never dreamed possible. But more than that, it had taught her that being different wasn't a weakness to hide. It was a strength to embrace and share with the world. On quiet evenings, when the diplomatic work was done and the policy meetings were finished, Lila would sit with Ashkor in their shared quarters, a tower chamber with open walls that allowed the dragon to come and go freely. Through their bond, they would share memories and dreams, planning for a future where humans and dragons work together as equals. Do you ever regret it? Lila asked one night, watching stars appear in the darkening sky, choosing to bond with a human instead of flying away to find the free dragons in the north. Ashkor's response flowed through their connection like warm honey. Freedom wasn't just about being unchained. It was about choosing your own path and companions. He'd found something with Lila that was more precious than solitary liberty. True partnership with someone who understood and valued him completely. Besides, his thoughts carried a note of ancient humor. Someone needs to make sure you don't get yourself killed with your tendency to take dangerous risks for the sake of others. Lila laughed, leaning against his warm scales as shooting stars began to trace paths across the sky. She'd started as a misfit who talked to animals. Now she was a bridge between species, helping to heal wounds that had festered for centuries. The kiss she'd given Ashkor that first night had indeed changed everything. But not through magic or prophecy, through the simple recognition that different didn't mean lesser, and that understanding could exist between any beings willing to open their hearts to each other. In the months that followed, other dragon bonds formed throughout the Empire and beyond. Humans and dragons who had been natural enemies learned to become partners, sharing knowledge and abilities that benefited both species. The world became richer, more complex, and infinitely more interesting. And in the eastern tower of the Imperial Palace, a girl who had once been nobody special and a dragon who had once been just a weapon continued to dream together of all the wonders that partnership could create. Their bond had sparked a revolution, but more importantly, it had proven that love and understanding could overcome even the deepest fears and prejudices. The misfit orphan girl had indeed dared to kiss the Empress's fiercest dragon. And in doing so, she changed not just her own fate, but the destiny of two entire species learning to live in harmony for the first time in centuries.